Saga from Azerbaijan. Chapter 3. The blacksmith Iskander. Tired as he was of his travels around the world, Bottom would like to return home immediately, but thought that it would be a failure. After traveling so much, return home empty-handed. And then, at dawn the next day, after saying goodbye to Zorab, Bottom resumed the road and, after traveling so much, finally coming to the city where the blacksmith Iskander lived, he found him precisely at the moment he was returning from one of those stampedes towards the cemetery, of which Zorab had spoken. Bottom asked then the merchant to let him spend the night at his residence, and the request was accepted. But when night came and dinner was set at the table, Bottom said, "I don't want to eat anything before I hear your story. Why is it that you, when put the hot iron on the anvil, barely raises the sledgehammer to flog it, you throw the tool to one side and ran like a crazy to the cemetery? For doing so, how becomes your expenses with coal and auxiliaries? But it is clear that, for this, must be some reason." The blacksmith then replied, "Let's eat, then. I will tell you my story." Bottom rejoiced with the response, and waited, impatiently, the end of the meal, after which the blacksmith began his narrative. "Years ago, I was muezzin in the mosque. My voice was so beautiful that, when I sang, birds came flying in flocks and gathered around the minaret to hear my singing. Thanks to my voice, I enjoyed great prestige in the city, and was well rewarded. I had the custom of using the minaret to convey the noon prayer. Then saw, by the clock, that it lacked only a quarter of an hour to the midday, and hoped the sure knock. There was then one day on what, while I was singing, a beautiful white bird came flying towards the minaret and almost brushed sideway in my head. I felt a great pleasure and stretched my arm to grab it. However, I barely touched it, and it flapped, taking me there to the top. To where I was taken by the bird, I do not know. I only know that, from upstairs, I saw the earth like it was just a small spot, although, due to my astonishment, I hardly dared to look down. How I came back to the earth, and in what place I had stayed, I also do not know. But I saw that it was in a wonderful plan. Through it, opened to me a path, that I started to follow. Suddenly, it was uncovered front of my eyes, a fascinating world. And I've been facing a huge castle of 7 floors and entirely of gold. Taken by the desire of to know whose that castle was, I walked in one of its doors and, climbing a ladder, I went from floor to floor, in constant admiration for what I was seeing. The walls, all of multicolor tiles, and the sculptures, that went emerging here and there, were of an indescribably beautiful. Suddenly, in one of the rooms on the most above floor, I met a beautiful woman, sleeping on a golden throne. And such was her beauty, that neither the sagas would be able to represent her, or the feathers to describe her. Stopped front of that sleeping beauty, I was like hypnotized and, fascinated with such beauty, I could not keep the impetus of my heart. Leaning down to kiss her, I lost my balance and fell on her. Immediately, she woke up and screamed so loud that could be heard throughout the castle. With her screams, the courtiers and servants came running. She then turned to them and, pointing at me, said, "This man wanted to dishonor me. What should we do with him?" One of the courtiers replied, "This bastard should have his head cut off." A second one added, "This man must be burned at the stake." And a third one complimented, "This shameless man should be thrown to the wild animals." During that time, I was shaken my whole body, and thought about what would happen to me if all these suggestions were really put into practice. Finally, the own princess made a decision and said, "I forgive him, for, when he saw me, his heart burned with love and led him to it. Who brought him here, must take him back. Put him out immediately." The order of princess was achieved punctually. They took me out of the castle and, after a little while, I was in the same place from where I had departed. The same bird, that before brought me to that place, came flying again and, taking me on his wings, led me there to the top again. After a short while, I was already there in the minaret again, from where I had departed just a quarter of an hour ago. I looked at the clock and it indicated to me, with its touches, that it was already noon. Immediately, I started singing the prayer. But my voice was so modified, that the people began to protest and make fun of me, saying, "How stupid you are! Is it with that voice that you want to be our muezzin?" When our muezzin began to sing, even the birds came flying to hear his singing. "With that voice, you can't be our muezzin. Between your voice and his, the difference is as wide as the distance between earth and sky." Deeply embittered, I listened to them talk like that. After I lost that voice, I didn't want to live in my city anymore. As I was married for only a few months, I left my young wife in the care of my mother and, by giving them money, so that they could survive until my return. As soon as I got my mother's blessing, I took the road. I went to another city, in a distant country, where I settled down and started to engage in the blacksmith occupation. There, I lived for 15 years, and, in time, my old voice began, gradually, to come back to me. So, as soon as I could gather the savings I expected, acquired thanks to hard work, I returned to my country. When I approached the city, it was already pretty dark, and the doors had already been closed. I was then forced to spend the night outside, waiting for the dawn the next day. But my heart was very restless. After such long absence, it was with the utmost impatience that I awaited a reunion with my family. Without much reflection, I decided to get into the city by any means. Leaving then my things and my horse outside, I climbed the wall and went directly to my residence. Everyone was already sleeping. Suddenly, I saw that a young boy, around 15 years old, was sleeping next to my wife. Given what I saw, I lost all my self-control, and was taken by the wildest fury and the deepest pain. Would it be possible that even my mother had deceived me, and that my so faithful wife had forgotten me and taken advantage of my absence to get a lover? Oh, Allah! I pulled out my sword and killed the three of them while still sleeping. I cut off the head, firstly, of my mother, then, of my unfaithful wife, and finally, of the boy. Ending the executions, I stuck the sword in the sheath and left my house. I climbed the wall again and waited outside, until the gates were opened. As soon as the gates opened, I got on my horse and rode into the inner city, when I was surrounded by a group of relatives that, pitifully crying, told me about the tragedy that had occurred in my residence the night before. And they said to me, "Last night, a ruthless criminal entered your house and cut off the head of your mother, your wife and your son." Just then I could realize my mistake. I began to sob, to pull my hair off, and to strike myself with my fists. But all in vain, for, what was lost, is lost. Days and nights, I spent crying in solitude, and the tears didn't relieve my sorrow. Then, I opened this smithy and started working, as you have seen. But, as soon as I put the hot iron on the anvil and lift the sledgehammer up to flog it, my mother, my wife and my son come to me without their heads, and start talking. First, my mother speaks, and says, "Ungrateful son, you left me with your pregnant wife, with only the care of divine providence, without having how to survive. Months later, she brought a child of yours into the world, and I had to walk around asking for alms, to give some comfort to your poor wife and the boy. Oh, Allah! How much penury didn't we have to suffer? But you, instead of showing gratitude, what you did was, without knowing what was happening, cut my head off." Then, my wife speaks, "Cruel husband. We lived together for 6 months, and then, without me knowing exactly the reason, you went abroad and left me without protection. I gave you a son and educated him carefully. When he cried and asked me where his father was, and when he would return, I tried to reassure him, saying, 'Your father is very far away, but soon he will come back, bringing many gifts for you.' In those 15 years, we have often starved, without getting even a loaf of bread to feed ourselves. But I endured, patiently, all those hardships, in the hope of a happy reunion with you. But, on the other hand, what you did was, without even check our conditions, cut my head off, thus victimizing your innocent wife. This was the reward that you gave me for all my misfortunes. Finally, my son speaks. Damn father, how did you have the courage to make your only and unhappy son lose his life in a so cruel way? How long did I not wait for your return and for a happy encounter with you? On the festive days, my colleagues wore new and beautiful clothes and received gifts from their parents, but because of my old and patched clothes, they made fun of me and called me fatherless. I then cried and asked my mother, "Is it true, mother, that I don't have a father?" My poor mother always soothed me, saying, "Calm down, my son. You have a father, and soon he will be back, with beautiful new clothes and gifts for you. And you will also be happy." But you, my father, thinking that my mother had betrayed you, shed the blood of 3 innocent martyrs. When this happens, I throw the hammer and the tongs to one side and try to grab them. But they escape, and I chase them to the cemetery, where they disappear into their graves. I then embrace, one by one, the 3 graves, and cry myself out until I get some relief. Then, I go back to my workshop and try to resume my work. But that occurs to me every day, as many times as putting the hot iron on the anvil. I lift the hammer to flog it. I am plagued by my own conscience, and my heart is an incurable wound. This is the whole secret of my behavior. How long this will last, I don't know. End of chapter 3.